there's no easy way to say this. What happened to Ariana Starkey is brutal, tragic, and unforgivable. And yet it really happened. I'm here to tell her story the way it deserves to be told. Ariana Starkey was just 4 years old, a little girl with wide, curious eyes and a laugh that could melt hearts. She had a way of lighting up a room, even without trying. Ariana loved the simple things in life, coloring books, cartoons, and her favorite pink stuffed bunny she never let go of. Her neighbors remembered her as shy at first, but sweet and playful once she warmed up to you. In daycare, she was the child who would share her toys even when no one asked her to. That's who Ariana was. Gentle, innocent, good. She lived in Indiana, in a small town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business, except for what was really going on behind Ariana's closed doors. Her home wasn't warm. It wasn't safe. It wasn't filled with the love a child like her deserved. Ariana lived with her mother, Victoria Stamper, and Victoria's boyfriend, Jacob Stacy. On the surface, it might have seemed like a normal arrangement, a young couple raising a child. But underneath it all, things were far from okay. Victoria had Ariana when she was still quite young. By all accounts, she struggled with motherhood. People who knew her said she seemed detached, like she was burdened by the responsibility of caring for a child. Jacob, on the other hand, had a criminal past and a reputation for anger issues. He wasn't Ariana's biological father, but he had stepped into that role. Unfortunately, not to protect her, but to control and eventually destroy everything innocent in her life. At first glance, the couple didn't raise too many red flags. But behind the scenes, there were warnings. People noticed Ariana with unexplained bruises. She seemed quieter, more withdrawn than other kids her age. There were whispers, concerns, but no one knew how bad it really was. No one knew that Ariana was quietly enduring a life no child should ever have to live. She was too young to fully understand what was happening, too small to defend herself, and too alone in a world that failed to catch her when she needed saving the most. But the signs were there, in the way she flinched when someone raised their voice, in the way she clung tightly to her stuffed bunny as if it was the only safe place in her world. This story isn't just about a little girl who died. It's about a system that didn't act, a mother who looked the other way, or worse, and a man who should have never been near a child. What happened to Ariana didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, silent buildup of pain, fear, and neglect. And by the time someone finally realized just how much danger she was in, it was already too late. The home where Ariana Starkey lived was supposed to be her safe place. Instead, it became the setting of unimaginable cruelty. Behind its closed doors, Ariana's short life unraveled, one painful day at a time. And what makes it all the more devastating is how quietly it happened, how easily her suffering was hidden in plain sight. As the months passed, people began to notice subtle but alarming changes in Ariana. She wasn't smiling as much anymore. That spark that made her so easy to love was dimming. Her once bright eyes seemed dull, tired, almost afraid. She grew thinner, quieter. Her teachers and daycare workers noticed bruises, odd marks, and that she flinched when touched. Sometimes, she came to daycare with unwashed hair, dirty clothes, or no coat in cold weather. On some days, she'd just sit by herself, lost in thought, unwilling to play with the other kids. But Ariana never said anything. She never cried for help. She had already learned that no one was coming. At home, Ariana's life was a daily nightmare. Victoria, her mother, often left her alone with Jacob while she went out or locked herself in her room. Jacob, who had a history of violent behavior, had complete control over the household and over Ariana. Witnesses later revealed that he treated her not like a child, but like a problem to be handled. His method of handling involved screaming, threats, and frequent beatings. Ariana was just 4, yet she was already navigating fear that most adults will never know. There were reports that she had been forced to stand in corners for hours, denied food, and slapped or punched when she cried. Some neighbors thought they heard yelling from the apartment at night, but no one ever called the police. And if they had, maybe Ariana's story would have ended differently. The final days of Ariana's life were filled with horror. According to later findings, she had endured escalating levels of abuse. Her tiny body showed signs of long-term trauma, both physical and emotional. In the last 24 hours before her death, Ariana had been brutally beaten. Her injuries were not sudden. They were built up over time, untreated and ignored. Jacob claimed she had fallen down the stairs. But the truth was far more disturbing. Ariana had suffered massive trauma. She was weak, unresponsive, and in visible distress. Yet no one called for help. No one took her to a doctor. Victoria, her own mother, didn't step in to stop what was happening. She either looked away or chose silence. And that silence was deadly. Instead of seeking help, the adults in the house let Ariana suffer in agony. Hours passed, then a day, until finally, when her condition worsened beyond what they could cover up, they made the call, but it was far too late. Emergency responders arrived at the home on May 3rd, 2023. By then, Ariana was unconscious and not breathing. She was rushed to the hospital, but the damage had already been done. Doctors saw the bruises, the head trauma, the signs of prolonged abuse. Her small body had endured more pain than many could imagine. Ariana Starky was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at the hospital. What followed was a whirlwind of horror and disbelief. The doctors didn't just see a case of trauma, they saw a pattern. This wasn't a freak accident. This was a child who had been failed again and again. Failed by the people closest to her. Failed by every adult who stayed quiet. And failed by a system that should have noticed something was wrong a long time ago. No one should have to hear about what happened to Ariana. But we must. Because this wasn't just the story of a little girl who died. It was the story of a child who was slowly broken, every day, until her body finally gave out. The question that would haunt investigators, neighbors, and the public was simple. How did no one stop this? By the time Ariana's story made it to the authorities, it was already a tragedy. A beautiful child, gone far too soon. And the people who were supposed to protect her, the very people who should have loved her the most, were now the ones under a glaring spotlight. When emergency responders arrived at the Starky residence on May 3rd, 2023, nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to find. The 911 call had come in late, far later than it should have. The caller reported that a 4-year-old girl was unconscious and unresponsive. But what paramedics discovered inside that home told a far darker story than just a medical emergency. It told a story of prolonged suffering, silence, and betrayal. Ariana was found lying on the floor, motionless, her body limp and cold. Her skin was pale, her breathing non-existent. The paramedics rushed to begin CPR, trying desperately to revive her. But as they worked, they started to notice the details that didn't match the story they were being told. There were bruises, old ones, fresh ones, marks around her head, legs, and arms. Her tiny body was covered in evidence of trauma. This wasn't a child who had simply fallen or gotten sick. This was something far worse. Police officers arrived moments later, and the scene quickly shifted from medical crisis to potential crime scene. The expressions on the faces of first responders said it all: shock, horror, and a deep, sinking sadness. Ariana wasn't just gone. She had been failed in every possible way. Inside the home, officers found Victoria Stamper and her boyfriend Jacob Stacy. Both appeared nervous, but not visibly emotional. Victoria clutched a phone, eyes darting between the medics and the officers. Jacob stood off to the side, arms folded, avoiding eye contact. When questioned separately, their stories were inconsistent. Victoria told officers that Ariana had fallen the day before but seemed okay at first. She claimed that by the next morning, Ariana was lethargic and wouldn't wake up. Jacob, however, said he didn't notice anything unusual until Ariana collapsed suddenly. He mentioned that she had been acting sick and sluggish for days. Neither explanation made sense. Neither one showed the urgency or panic one would expect from caretakers of a dying child. Officers took note of the inconsistencies. More importantly, they took note of Ariana's physical state. Her body bore the signs of not one incident, but many. She was malnourished, covered in bruises, with injuries that weren't fresh. The truth was beginning to take shape, but it was only the beginning. Back at the hospital, doctors confirmed what many already suspected. Ariana hadn't died of natural causes. She had suffered from repeated blunt force trauma. Her head injury alone was enough to be fatal. And yet, this little girl had lived with those injuries for hours, maybe even days, without receiving any help. Detectives began their official investigation that same day. They secured the apartment, collected evidence, and initiated formal interviews. Victoria maintained her version of events, claiming she had no idea what was happening and that she did everything she could. Jacob, meanwhile, remained evasive, often replying with, "I don't know," or "She was fine yesterday." The lack of immediate confession meant no arrests were made on the spot. Authorities needed to build a case, and fast. As they combed through Ariana's records and living conditions, the story grew more damning. They discovered that Child Protective Services had been involved in Ariana's life before. Reports had been made. Neighbors, daycare staff, even medical professionals had raised concerns over the months. Bruises, weight loss, emotional withdrawal. But each time, the reports led to limited or temporary investigations. Nothing stuck. Ariana was either returned to her home, or the case was closed for lack of evidence. In hindsight, every one of those missed calls now felt like a nail in her coffin. One report, made just weeks before her death, described Ariana showing up at daycare with dark bruises on her back and legs. When questioned, she simply said, "I fell." The caseworker who followed up reportedly saw no reason to remove her from the home. No visible danger at the time. No proof. Just one more chance to save her gone. As detectives pieced everything together, a dark timeline began to form. The signs were there, over and over. The people around Ariana noticed. Some even tried to help, but the system moved slowly. And within that window of inaction, Ariana's life slipped away. Inside the interrogation room, detectives now saw Victoria and Jacob not as grieving guardians, but as the central figures in a growing storm of evidence. Their stories didn't match. Their emotions felt rehearsed. And most importantly, their neglect was now impossible to ignore. What began as a simple call for help had now become a full-blown homicide investigation. And Ariana's name, once just a child's name on a daycare list, was now at the center of one of the most heartbreaking cases the town had ever seen. The truth was coming, piece by piece. And soon, it would be impossible for anyone, especially Victoria and Jacob, to hide from it. The turning point in Ariana Starkey's case didn't come from a confession. It came from the facts. Cold, unflinching, undeniable. The lies that Victoria Stamper and Jacob Stacy had clung to were starting to unravel, and it was only a matter of time before the truth forced its way to the surface. Detectives began reviewing phone records, social media activity, and text message logs from both Victoria and Jacob. What they uncovered shattered any illusion that Ariana's death had been an accident or a moment of poor judgment. In several disturbing text exchanges between the couple, Jacob complained about Ariana's behavior, calling her names, expressing frustration over her crying, and even mocking her pain. In one message, he wrote, "I can't take her screaming anymore. She needs to learn." Victoria's replies weren't filled with concern or defense. Instead, she agreed, sometimes even laughed. There were no texts about getting Ariana help. No plans to intervene. Just silence. Approval. Neglect. Investigators also obtained medical records showing that Ariana had visited emergency care more than once in the months before her death. The reasons varied. A fall, a bump, stomach issues. But the pattern was clear. She was being hurt repeatedly, and the explanations were always just believable enough to let it slide. Doctors documented bruises inconsistent with the stories given but lacked the authority to remove Ariana without further proof. Still, each report added another piece to the puzzle, one that was becoming impossible to ignore. Neighbors and family members were interviewed next. One woman who lived downstairs said she heard what sounded like thuds and yelling almost every other night. Another neighbor, who shared a wall with the family's apartment, admitted that Ariana's crying had become so frequent, she had learned to block it out. A distant relative came forward, saying she had tried to gain custody of Ariana months earlier, believing the home was unstable. But her concerns were dismissed. Victoria had legal custody, and there wasn't enough evidence at the time to justify a change. And then came the most damning discovery: prior reports to Child Protective Services. At least 3 formal complaints had been filed over the course of a year. One came from a daycare worker who noticed Ariana had a black eye. Another from a nurse who observed bruising on her lower back and arms. And a third from a neighbor who claimed she overheard Jacob threatening Ariana through the walls. Each time, a caseworker was assigned. Each time, the investigation was either closed due to insufficient evidence or left inactive after a brief visit to the home. The reports weren't vague. They were clear, detailed, and urgent, but nothing ever came of them. As the full scope of Ariana's suffering came into focus, the public reaction turned from shock to fury. How had this little girl been seen by so many teachers, neighbors, healthcare workers, and yet remained unprotected? How had a system designed to shield children from abuse failed her over and over again? Detectives confronted Victoria and Jacob separately with the evidence: the text messages, the CPS reports, the statements from witnesses, the inconsistencies in their timelines. Victoria's mask began to slip. She started shifting blame, claiming she didn't know how bad it had gotten, that Jacob had gone too far, and that she had been too scared to act. But her texts told a different story. She hadn't just ignored the abuse. She had allowed it, enabled it, participated in it. Jacob, for his part, stayed cold and distant. When cornered with the evidence, he refused to speak further without a lawyer. But he didn't need to. The truth was already in the hands of the investigators. By the end of that week, police announced that both Victoria Stamper and Jacob Stacy were officially charged in the murder of Ariana Starky. Jacob faced charges of murder, aggravated battery, and neglect of a dependent resulting in death. Victoria faced charges of neglect, failure to protect, and aiding and abetting abuse. It was no longer a question of what happened. That was now clear. Ariana hadn't slipped through the cracks. She had been shoved through them, again and again. And now, the very people responsible for her suffering, the people she called Mommy and Daddy, would have to face what they had done. The arrests came just days after Ariana Starky's death, but for those who had followed her short, tragic life, it felt long overdue. On May 6, 2023, police officers arrived at the small Indiana apartment complex where Victoria Stamper and Jacob Stacy were staying. This time, they weren't there to ask questions. They were there to take the couple into custody. Jacob was arrested first. He didn't resist. He didn't cry. He didn't ask why. When officers read him his rights and placed handcuffs around his wrists, he simply stared ahead, stone-faced. Victoria was found inside, pacing nervously. She broke down the moment the officers told her she was under arrest. She begged them to let her explain, to give her one more chance. But that chance had been Ariana's, and it was already gone. The charges were severe. Jacob Stacy was booked for murder, aggravated battery, neglect of a dependent resulting in death, and multiple counts of child abuse. Victoria Stamper was charged with neglect, failure to protect, and aiding and abetting. According to investigators, while she may not have delivered the final fatal blow, her inaction, and at times, participation, was just as deadly. The arrest affidavits painted a damning picture of the couple's daily life and the nightmare Ariana was living in. Through interviews, forensic evidence, and digital records, authorities were able to piece together a timeline of abuse so severe, it shocked even seasoned detectives. For months, maybe longer, Ariana had been targeted inside her own home. It began with verbal abuse, yelling, name-calling, shaming a toddler for crying or wetting herself. Then came isolation. Jacob often forced her to stand in a dark room for hours or locked her in a closet as punishment. Neighbors described hearing her sobbing behind the walls, sometimes well into the night. Then came the beatings. Consistent, deliberate, calculated. Ariana would show up with fresh bruises, sometimes limping. Her daycare workers noted that she often appeared fearful, flinching when adults moved too quickly. She had begun eating excessively during snack time, as if she didn't know when she'd eat again. Investigators later confirmed she had been denied meals as punishment at home. The motive? It wasn't just one thing. It was a horrifying combination of cruelty, power, neglect, and dysfunction. Jacob Stacy had a history of domestic violence. He had assaulted previous partners. In one documented case, he was accused of choking a girlfriend during an argument. He had also been investigated for substance abuse and violent outbursts. Victoria had remained with him despite knowing these things. And worse, she had allowed him to discipline her daughter, unchecked and unrestricted. There were also text messages where Victoria mocked Ariana's cries or complained about her being a brat. One read, "She needs to stop crying like a baby. I'm over it." In others, Jacob casually admitted to smacking Ariana for not listening or throwing stuff. None of these messages showed remorse. None suggested that Ariana's safety ever came first. This was not a case of sudden rage or a tragic accident. This was a calculated, long-term pattern of abuse inflicted on a child who had no one else. She was not just forgotten, she was targeted. And what's worse, no one stepped in to stop it. Digging further into Jacob and Victoria's history, police found previous complaints that had never escalated. In 2021, a neighbor called police after allegedly witnessing Jacob shove Ariana in the yard. The report was filed, but without physical evidence, it was closed. In 2022, a relative of Victoria's tried to intervene after seeing Ariana with a swollen lip, but her concerns were dismissed as family drama. CPS had visited the home at least 3 times in the year before Ariana's death. Each time, the couple managed to clean up just enough to avoid deeper scrutiny. Ariana would be dressed well, coached on what to say, and the apartment would appear neat. Caseworkers would leave, unaware that the minute the door closed, the abuse resumed. The system had cracks, and Ariana fell through every one of them. But the worst betrayal didn't come from strangers or agencies. It came from the 2 people she should have trusted most, her mother and the man her mother brought into her life. A child's world is small. For Ariana, that world revolved around Victoria. And instead of shielding her daughter from harm, she handed her over to it. She chose a violent relationship over her own child. She closed her eyes, covered her ears, and let Ariana suffer alone. At the press conference following the arrests, the police chief's voice trembled as he spoke. "This is a heartbreaking case. One of the worst we've seen. Ariana deserved so much more love, more protection, more time. And she didn't get any of it." As the news spread, outrage swept through the community. Vigils were held. Stuffed animals and candles lined the sidewalk in front of Ariana's apartment. People wrote notes, "We're sorry. You mattered. Rest in peace, little angel." But none of it could undo what had been done. Ariana Starky was gone. And the people responsible weren't strangers. They were the ones who were supposed to love her. And now they would face justice. The trial for Ariana Starky's murder began nearly a year after her death, but the grief and outrage in the courtroom felt just as raw as the day she died. By that time, the community knew her name. Her face, bright-eyed and innocent, had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, not just in one household, but in the very systems meant to protect children like her. Victoria Stamper and Jacob Stacy were tried separately, each facing a list of horrifying charges. Jacob's were the most severe: first-degree murder, aggravated battery, neglect of a dependent resulting in death, and multiple counts of child abuse. Victoria's charges included neglect of a dependent, aiding and abetting, and failure to protect, a charge that carried heavy weight in the eyes of the public. From the moment the trial began, it was clear the prosecutors were determined to make sure Ariana's voice, silenced far too soon, would be heard through the evidence. They laid out the timeline with chilling precision, walking the jury through every ignored warning, every injury, every opportunity to save her that had been missed. The text messages between Victoria and Jacob were read aloud in court. The jury heard Jacob's mocking tone, Victoria's cold replies. They saw photos of Ariana's bruises. They listened as forensic experts described the trauma Ariana endured in her final days. The defense tried to shift the blame. Jacob's attorney painted him as a man struggling with stress and drug use, suggesting that Ariana's death was a tragic accident made worse by poor judgment. Victoria's attorney argued that she was a victim of domestic abuse, too scared to defy Jacob. They claimed she had no real power, that she was trapped. But the prosecution pushed back hard. Being afraid does not excuse doing nothing while your child is tortured, the lead prosecutor said in court. Victoria didn't just fail Ariana, she gave her over to the very man who ended her life. Witness after witness took the stand. Neighbors who had heard screams but didn't know what to do, daycare workers who had reported bruises, and a relative who had once begged for custody. One CPS worker testified with visible emotion, admitting that signs had been missed. I thought she was okay, the worker said through tears. I was wrong. The jury was visibly affected by the evidence. Some members wept quietly. Others avoided looking at the autopsy images. The entire courtroom seemed to carry the weight of Ariana's suffering. In a moment that silenced the room, the prosecutor held up one of Ariana's stuffed animals, the one she had been found with, and said, "This is the only comfort she had. Not her mother, not her home, just this." After 2 weeks of testimony, Jacob Stacy was found guilty on all counts. The judge did not hesitate in handing down the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his statement, the judge said, "Your actions were not impulsive. They were consistent, cool, unforgivable. You ended a child's life in a way that defies reason, and you will spend the rest of your life facing that." Victoria's trial concluded shortly after. The jury also found her guilty of all charges. She was sentenced to 40 years in prison, with the judge citing her willful neglect and failure to protect her daughter. "You had chances," he told her, "and you let them pass. Ariana needed a mother. She got a bystander." Outside the courtroom, reactions were swift and emotional. Dozens of people gathered during both verdicts, holding signs that read, "Justice for Ariana" and "Protect our children." Some brought flowers. Others brought stuffed animals, laying them on the courthouse steps. A few women held candles, whispering prayers under their breath. The case became a flashpoint in the state. Local lawmakers faced growing pressure to reform child welfare practices. Ariana's death was cited in heated debates over how CPS responds to repeated abuse reports. New proposals were drafted, including a bill that would require mandatory follow-ups on all abuse claims involving repeat offenders.